This time on Rad Rat Video, we're going to review a book called Tony Hawk's Gaming Domination, which covers every single version of every single Tony Hawk title ever made. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Rad Rat Video, a channel where you can learn new things about skateboarding. I talk about a lot of stuff on this channel. You can learn tricks on the Shred School, you can watch biographies of your favorite pros on the Retro Rippers playlist, and all kinds of other stuff, hopefully more and more consistently as I get settled into my new house. But for now, I wanted to take a look at a book called Tony Hawk's Gaming Domination, written by a guy named Trevor Esposito. You might not know the name off the top of your head, but you might know what he went by online, which is Slate Man. So he ran a site called Planet Tony Hawk back in the day. It's the biggest fan site online. You could look up previews of the games before they came out. You could see high score videos. You could see walkthroughs to help you find the gaps in the skate letters and all that kind of stuff. I was on there pretty much every single day. Love that site. So when he reached out to me and said he wrote a book, I was really excited to take a look at it. And there's a lot in this book. So we're talking about every single version of every single game. We're talking pictures of the beta, the changes in the unreleased betas. We're talking context from, what else was going on when the games were coming out. Stories from the developers of what was going on and what they were thinking when they did certain things. Tons and tons of information, screenshot comparisons of the different versions of the games, and a lot of stuff like that. So as a review of the book, what I wanted to do was go through every main title in the series and pick out a couple interesting facts that I found in the book. We're talking maybe like 1% of what's actually in the book, but there's just so much in here that I really wanted to share some of it. All right, so let's get started with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1. In the mall in Tony Hawk 1, there was a pizza place called Pizza Face. But before it was called that, in the beta version, it was actually called Victor's Secret, like a male lingerie store or something like that. Apparently that was considered a little too risque and they had to cut it. They had a lot of different censorship issues that they ran into. There's another one in the next game that you'll see. But that doesn't seem too bad, but it would have been a lot funnier. The next thing is a weird cheat code in the N64 version of the game. It'll bring up pictures of women on the screen and no one really knew why. There was a rumor that it was Tony Hawk's wife, but it's not. So, and there's a couple different pictures you can get in different ways, and so the only real theory is that people who worked on the game put pictures of their girlfriends or wives or whoever and hid them in the game somehow, but no one really knows for sure. In Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, if you do a really short grind, it calls it a kiss the rail. But they had another system for weak grabs. So in the E3 demo before the game came out, you could do something called a weak fish. This was if you just touched a stale fish instead of holding the grab. It would call it a weak fish or a weak stiffy or something like that. And they ended up cutting that out of the game because players didn't understand that this was a separate trick from the full version. They didn't know that they were being punished for not holding it. It just didn't make any sense, and so they cut out that whole system. Speaking of grabs, here's the Helen Keller grab, which is a backside mute grab, which was a joke that apparently went a little bit too far, and that ended up getting censored as well. Tony Hawk 3 had an exclusive Japanese release of the game, and it actually included 3 Japanese pros. Junosuke Yonesaka, Hiroki Sayagusa, and the only one I actually know, Shin Okada. They were all exclusive in this version of the game. And one of those guys had the 540 flip as a special trick. That was a special you could assign in the other versions of the game, but it wasn't assigned to any of the pros. So they didn't do anything too special, make any of their special tricks, but they did make an effort to not just copy and paste one of the pros that was there already. But something really interesting, another censorship thing, in the PS1 version of Tony Hawk 3, there's a trick called the Antichrist flip, which is a Christ air that's inverted, so you're doing a flip, so they call it the Antichrist air. And in a really weird twist, they assigned it to Jamie Thomas, the guy on the team who was very Christian. He had scriptures on his deck graphics and stuff like that. It's really weird that they did that. It's probably just an inside joke or something. Didn't make it to the final game, but it is seen in beta versions that came out before the game was released. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 was renamed Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2003 for release in Japan, but they released it in May 2004, hilariously. Don't know why they didn't just change the number when they knew it was going to be 5 months late, but they just went for it anyway. But Tony Hawk 4 had a ton of really weird versions. It's the most prolific of any of the games in the entire series, and I'm going to show you some of the other versions you've probably never heard of. There were 2 mobile versions of the game, and the first one was only vert, and this is what they used to advertise it. You choose the venue, then try to execute awesome moves like grind, invert, tail grab, and spin 360. There was no depth to the game, but it was 2003, so pretty much nothing on phones had any depth. But weirdly, they actually made a second Tony Hawk 4 mobile game a little bit later, and so they renamed the first one to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 Vert, and then the new one was Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 Street. And this one was a lot like the Game Boy Color games. You can check my review of the Game Boy Color ones here to get an idea of what it might have been like. The thing is, a lot of these phone games are lost to time. There's not a way to play them online for the most part. So unless you have an old phone that already has it installed on it, a lot of these are lost. So I give a lot of props to this book for actually having screenshots of all these games and being able to track them down. But that's not the weirdest version. How about this one? This is on the THPS Zodiac, which is a failed handheld system that came out around 2003, and it has quadruple the resolution of the Game Boy Advance. So what they did was they took the Game Boy Advance game, which was genuinely really good, and they quadrupled it, so it was just a lot clearer and looked a lot sharper. That was probably really good, probably the best way to play the game. It had more face buttons on the Game Boy Advance. You had to use the shoulder buttons for flips and stuff. Not that great, but this version was probably really good. The only thing was that system failed. Came out not too long before the DS and then the PSP, and it just kind of got blown out of the water. But there's an even more rare, obscure handheld system called the Digiblast, which only came out in Europe, and it was not that powerful. It was aimed at kids, so it has a port of the GBA version on it as well. Probably not that good, but the thing is, it's so rare. The system and the game are both extremely rare, so it's hard to say for sure. Next, let's take a look at Tony Hawk's Underground. Most of you have never seen a PC version of the game, but weirdly there was one. It just came out 2 years after the console version, and it was only released in New Zealand and Australia, which is pretty weird already, but what's even weirder is that it came out 6 months after Thug 2 did, which is completely crazy. There's no explanation that can be found as to why this happened, whether it was just sitting on a back shelf and they just decided to release it. It's a decent port of the game, it's just they didn't do anything special with it, and it took forever to come out. The other interesting thing about the game is that there was a Thug controller that came out, but weirdly there's no Activision logo or anything on this controller, so it's probably fake, but it is out there. It's really expensive and rare to find though. Next, let's take a look at Thug 2. There's some interesting things about the way they marketed the game. They actually made a Flash game for the game, which was just the tagging stuff. It's not like they tried to remake the game in Flash or anything, but it's just another version of a Tony Hawk game that's official, that exists, but is probably lost to time. Don't know if anyone's downloaded that Flash game and has kept it this whole time, but it's interesting to know that that exists somewhere. The other cool thing is that Thug 2 lives on in a mod called Thug Pro, and I played that right here. It's probably been updated a bit since then. There's a chapter on it in the book. Thug Pro is a mod where you can get the levels from a lot of Tony Hawk games, not every single level of every game, but a lot of them into one package. And, you know, it's in HD and all that kind of stuff. You can play it online still. That's the big draw. You can go back and play your favorite Tony Hawk online multiplayer modes in any stage. So you can play School 2, you can play, you know, it's based on Thug 2, so anything up to that point, and I think some from after it too. Really, really cool mod, and so that's why the PC version of Thug 2 is actually still pretty important, even though the game wasn't that great and the port wasn't special either. It's just made a good basis for such a cool mod. Tony Hawk's American Wasteland had a special collector's edition on the PS2. It came wrapped in actual grip tape, had some extra characters, and it had a making of documentary with the game too. It was only on the PS2, they didn't do it for the other versions of the Xbox or anything like that, which is kind of interesting. I tried to track down a copy when I was going to do my review of the game, and I ended up settling for a normal one. I don't think they're that hard to find, not crazy expensive, but it's not really worth it unless you're a true collector. But something else about the game is that the Nintendo versions, the DS and the Game Boy Advance, were renamed American Skateland with an 8. And they really changed the graphical style, made it really cartoony, really, really kid-friendly, which is kind of weird. I wouldn't think the word wasteland would scare off parents, but apparently that's what they thought. These games are supposedly pretty good. It's just that they made it really kid-centric this time. So I hope to review those in the future. But it is very similar in the story and everything. They just kind of changed the name. During the development of Tony Hawk's Project 8, some of the guys who were working on the game had printouts of bad reviews of the last couple ones, and they had them posted around their desks to help remind them that the game was supposed to be more authentic and more skateboarding centric. So if you keep in mind, American Wasteland and Thug 2 were a lot less about skateboarding. You're riding around on like motorized scooters and doing all kinds of weird stuff like that. And Project 8 was more skateboarding, authentic skateboarding centered, and the reviews were actually a little bit better. For the first time since, I think, Tony Hawk 3, the actual average scores went back up a little bit. Not by much. The game was not a huge success, but that apparently helped to some degree. But something else that was really weird about this game is that the PS2 version is the highest selling one. So not the next gen version, there's the 360 and the PS3 versions. Those are outsold by the PS2 version. I think that's the only time when the non-Neversoft version was outsold by the port. Kind of crazy. And the PS2 version actually had a special edition that came with a birdhouse deck in it. It's so weird that they did that with the PS2. If you're a huge fan, are you going to buy the old version with a deck, or are you going to buy the new version to get the best experience? Kind of weird that they did it that way. Tony Hawk's Downhill Jam had some really, really weird cheats. You could change the size of birds. You could choose to skate with fish if you wanted to. And there was a cheat that would turn your character into a deformed cow. There was a Wii version of Tony Hawk's Proving Ground, which they made without support for the classic controller. The Wii controller that actually has buttons on it, you had to play with the Wiimote and the nunchuck. And apparently it played very, very badly. To do any of the nail the trick modes, where it slows down, you kick your feet around stuff, you had to actually flick the controllers and stuff like that. Very imprecise. The game did really badly. Something else that they messed up was they had the button for grabs and reverts the same thing. So if you're trying to hold a grab, you'd have to let go and hit it again real quick to try to do a revert. Just a huge mess. I have no idea why they chose to make it that way, but it flopped. Tony Hawk's Ride was the game that came out with a skateboard controller that you could lean and you could, make the character do stuff by turning and stuff like that on it. And I've been trying to find this game for so long. This is not the fun fact, but I've been trying to find this game for so long. It's impossible to find one with the dongle, the little thing you plug into your system. And I have a PS3, which is the more rare version anyway. I found one at Goodwill last week. I was so excited. It came with the box. It had the game. It had the controller in it, everything. I opened it up at the store and I realized that the dongle is missing. To try to find that online is like $30 on top of buying the game and the controller anyway, which sucks. But I really want to play that for you guys, and I'm going to do it. I just don't know when I'm going to happen to stumble upon one. But as for the interesting facts about the game, the controller has a D-pad on it. It has all the buttons lined up around the width of the deck. And in theory, you could use it to move around the menus and all that kind of stuff. But on the PS3 and 360, the D-pad does nothing. It just doesn't work, which is kind of hilarious. On the Wii, it actually works fine, but they just completely forgot to program it or something. I don't know. It doesn't do anything, which is kind of stupid. But something else they did, they knew the game was going to suck. They released the review copies 10 days late, so there was no way that people could actually see how bad the game was before they saw it in the store. That's what publishers do when they know the game's going to suck. But something else that's really weird is that pro skater Alex Olsen is supposed to be in the game. He's in the credits and everything, but he's not in it. There's probably a way to unlock him that people just haven't found yet, which is kind of funny. The game was so bad that no one really cared to 100% the game and figure out every little secret. He's probably in the game. It's just that the info for how to get him is lost, so we don't really know. Tony Hawk Shred was the next game that came out. It used the controller and everything. It was basically what Tony Hawk Ride should have been. It was much better, but it was more focused toward kids. Tony Hawk will come on screen and explain how to play the game and how to stand on the controller and stuff like that. Very kid-centric. And so when they brought back The police officer, Officer Dick, they renamed him Officer Richard, which is kind of stupid. But this time, there's also another player that is unlockable, but no one knows how to do it. His name is Joe Chiegla, he's not a pro skater. He's a guy who makes skate parks in California. Kind of weird that he would be included in a Tony Hawk game anyway, but he kind of isn't, even though there's screenshots of his character out there. No one knows how to play as him. Tony Hawk's HD, which I reviewed right here, was not a great game, but it did something new in the series. It was the first major DLC pack. They released the Revert pack about 5 or 6 months after the game came out. And the theory behind that was to do some of the Tony Hawk 3 stages, so LA, Canada, and the airport. And then update the mechanics so you could do the reverts from that game. And that's what they did, but they actually unlocked the revert for the entire game. So you could go into school too and do them and everything like that. So as soon as they released this pack, every high score was garbage. Because, anyone doing a revert can beat the best high score in the world for Tony Hawk 2. So they kind of messed everything up with that. But it was cool that it was the first major DLC pack, and it wasn't just, decks or anything like that. But something else kind of interesting about this game is that it's no longer available. It was download only, and the music rights have expired. So if you didn't get it before December 2017, I think it's gone. And there's no way to get it. It was like $1.99 on Steam the week before it went down. I tweeted about it. I wanted to make sure everyone got a chance to. But if you missed it, don't worry about it. Just play Tony Hawk 2 and you'll be fine. There's a really interesting story about the release of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 and an explanation of why it might have sucked so much. So Activision had the license to the Tony Hawk series until the end of 2015. And so they had to put out a game before that time or else they would have lost the license. And so they had to hurry up and put this game out really, really quickly. As you probably know, they released a disc that had pretty much nothing on it. And then a giant day one patch was like 6 gigs or something like that made the game actually work. But it got terrible reviews. Everyone hated it. Lots of glitches. A lot of stuff just didn't work right. It seemed unfinished. And it probably was. They were just rushing to get the game out. But interesting thing is, about 2 months later, they put out a huge patch. So the day one patch was like 6 gigs, which is already giant. This was 8. And it added in new stages. It added in lots of bug fixes. They did a lot of stuff. Made the game actually playable and decent and not horrible. I want to do a review of that in the near future. But that version came out in November. It was still within the deadline. If they had waited and done all of that at once, put the game out with all the patches included, that might have gotten much, much better scores instead of scoring 4s. Maybe it would have gotten 6s and 7s. If it had built some momentum going, they might have been able to build off of it after that. But the way that they handled it was so bad that it completely killed the series forever. So those are some interesting facts that I found in the book. There's a lot more stuff from the series. So there were some of the titles I didn't even talk about. Tony Hawk's Motion was a Nintendo DS game that used the Game Boy Advance slot as a sensor so you could tilt and everything. I don't have a DS. I have a 3DS I play my DS games on. So I'll never be able to play that for the channel. But there's stuff about that. There's the app. I think it was called Shred Session. They released it in a test market. It didn't do well, so they pulled it back and it never came out. There's lots of stuff about that. He talks to different people who worked on the games, lots of stuff, lots of charts, how the scores plotted over time, tons and tons and tons of information. If you're interested in this book, you can go to TonyHawk'sGamingDomination.com and check it out. I highly enjoyed my read-through of this book. If you like all the gaming reviews and stuff I do, no doubt you'll like it too. So check that out. But until next time here on the channel, hit the subscribe button. Hopefully I'm going to be getting back into reviewing the Tony Hawk series myself, but also all the other stuff I do, teaching tricks and all that stuff. I live right by a skate park now, so hopefully I'll be able to do some grinds and other things like that coming up soon. But just stay tuned, and thanks for watching.